commissioner dodged Karoline Leavitt's tough questions in a hearing, and minutes later, the White House press secretary had the room in stunned silence with a $2 billion truth bomb. You won't believe what just happened. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. It's not about fame or politics or headlines. It's about one woman who walked into a congressional hearing and asked the question no one else dared to ask. What happened to $2 billion meant for the people? Her name is Karoline Leavitt, and what unfolded next wasn't loud, but it shook the entire room. No drama, no shouting, just truth, and the undeniable impact of standing up when it matters most. So if you're someone who believes in justice, transparency, and inspiring stories that remind us of what real leadership looks like, this one's for you. Let's dive in. The hearing room wasn't quiet. It was charged. Tension hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Protesters held signs calling for transparency, and reporters clustered around the entrance, trying to catch glimpses of the woman at the center of it all. Inside, Karoline Leavitt stood alone at the witness table. She wasn't rattled. In fact, she looked like someone who had walked through fire before. Calm, measured, and holding a binder thick with documents and truths that no one else had dared to put in one place. Her eyes scanned the panel of officials. She wasn't here for them. She was here for the people they'd forgotten. Families waiting on assistance that never came. Communities whose voices had been swallowed by red tape. At the far end of the room sat Commissioner Elias Warren, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly on the desk in front of him. His title carried weight. He oversaw funding allocation for public programs, housing, healthcare, infrastructure. Billions of taxpayer dollars passed through his hands, and recently $2 billion of it had been rerouted, quietly, legally, and without explanation. Until now. Karoline stepped to the microphone. The room hushed. "Commissioner Warren," she said, her voice low but resolute, "do you believe your directive overrides policies that were approved by elected representatives and signed into law by the executive branch?" Warren opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a staffer burst through the chamber door. He whispered something into the ear of the committee chair, who nodded, then looked toward Karoline. "Miss Leavitt, we've just received a new disclosure. You may want to see this." The chair handed her a sealed envelope. She opened it slowly, the crinkle of the paper loud in the quiet room. Inside was an internal memo, leaked just that morning, showing that Warren had used a rarely invoked clause, known as a discretionary emergency override, to bypass two standard audit procedures. Karoline read it. She didn't flinch. She raised her eyes to Warren. "So this wasn't a miscommunication. It was a decision, a deliberate one." Warren shifted in his seat. "The clause exists for urgent circumstances. We believed—" "Who's we?" Karoline interrupted, still calm. "And what was the urgency?" "Because here's what happened after that directive. A food program for inner-city schools was cut in half. A veteran housing grant was delayed indefinitely. A community health clinic in rural Nebraska had to close its doors." She reached for her binder and opened it. Inside were records, statements, emails, reports, each one marked by a colored tab. Each tab represented a story, a consequence, a person. These aren't numbers, they're names, they're neighborhoods. They're people who thought they mattered to this system. You redirected their future without so much as a town hall or press release. The cameras clicked. The committee members glanced at each other. Karoline kept going. "I'm not here to make noise. I'm here to ask, when did accountability become optional?" She turned a page. "This document confirms that of the $2 billion moved, over 60% went to foreign infrastructure partnerships with no public tracking, no performance metrics, and no follow-up evaluations." Warren tried to speak again, but Karoline raised her hand gently. "I understand that global collaboration is important, but not at the expense of the people who pay the bills. Not without transparency, not like this." The silence was heavy now, not bored silence, listening silence. She looked at the committee directly. "You invited me here to offer insight, so here it is. The problem isn't just this decision, the problem is the system that allowed it to happen quietly. That's not just a flaw in process, that's a fracture in public trust." Warren's shoulders tensed. Karoline closed the binder, letting the soft thump echo across the chamber. You can call it oversight, you can call it strategy, but what the people see is abandonment, and they've had enough of it. She stepped back from the mic. The room remained still. No applause, no reaction, just the sound of truth settling where silence used to be. The storm had entered the chamber, and Karoline Leavitt had brought it with her. The soft echo of the binder closing still lingered in the air when Karoline Leavitt spoke again, not from behind the microphone this time, but standing closer to the panel, binder open in her hands, a single tab marked in red. This page, she said, details the reallocation that shut down a workforce development grant in Millbrook, Ohio. It was set to help over 1,200 people re-enter the job market. Instead, it disappeared mid-implementation without explanation. Commissioner Warren sat upright, eyes fixed ahead. His silence was careful now. Each word he hadn't yet said felt louder than anything he might. Karoline flipped to the next tab. Here's another. Camden County, New Jersey. Emergency housing aid pulled 4 days before approval. The district's nonprofit partner laid off its entire outreach team. Over 300 families were put back on the waiting list. A wave of discomfort swept through the chamber. The committee members shifted. The weight of specifics, of faces behind numbers, was starting to land. Warren cleared his throat. Miss Leavitt, with respect, these decisions were made as part of a broader vision. Long-term benefit requires sacrifice. Karoline paused, then turned back toward him. Sacrifice, she repeated, but whose? She let the question hang for a beat, then continued. We keep saying these reallocations are strategic, but if they were so essential, why hide them in a discretionary clause? Why weren't they announced publicly, debated, or reviewed? Why are the most vulnerable communities always the ones asked to sacrifice, while no one with authority is ever asked to explain? Warren didn't answer, and that silence spoke volumes. Karoline returned to the binder, flipping forward. Several of these programs had completed their audits, passed every federal requirement, and had bipartisan backing. Some were even mid-disbursement. She looked up. This isn't about what was legal, it's about what was ethical. The audience behind her, staffers, concerned citizens, began whispering among themselves. Phones lit up, someone in the back was live streaming already, tagging the clip. Karoline Leavitt speaks. Then came another ripple. A committee staffer handed a note to the chair, who read it with raised brows and nodded. Miss Leavitt, he said, we've just received a request from Mayor Helen Dorsey of Bellevue, Nebraska. She's asked to join us remotely. Her city was one of the areas affected by the program termination last month. Karoline stepped aside as the screen behind the panel lit up. Mayor Dorsey appeared, middle-aged, exhausted, speaking from what looked like a small-town office. Our mobile health unit was serving 5 counties, she said. The grant was canceled 2 weeks after we opened. We've already had to turn away dozens of patients. Our nearest hospital is over 50 miles away. The mayor's voice cracked. Last week, we lost someone. He didn't make it in time. The room fell still. Not a single movement, not even a cough, just the low hum of the monitor and the heaviness of truth settling into the wood-paneled walls. Karoline stepped forward. Commissioner Warren, is that what sacrifice looks like? Warren shifted, opening a folder slowly, though he didn't seem to read it. I understand the concerns, he began, but we are also dealing with global commitments, sustainability efforts, humanitarian partnerships. There are benefits that are harder to quantify. Karoline nodded once, slowly. Harder to quantify, she repeated, but easy to explain when those suffering don't have a microphone. She turned to the committee. This hearing wasn't supposed to be about emotions. But when programs are cut without transparency, what do you expect? When people are left behind in silence, how else do they speak? The committee members said nothing, but one of them, a young representative from Illinois, leaned forward and scribbled something onto his notepad with visible urgency. Karoline lifted the binder again. These aren't isolated incidents. They're a pattern, and patterns reveal priorities. She let the sentence settle. Right now, our systems are protecting policies, but not people. Warren's hands fidgeted slightly, his thumb rubbing the edge of his folder. He glanced at the screen, still showing the mayor's tired face, and then down again. Karoline's voice dropped to a whisper, just loud enough to carry. You don't have to defend this. You can admit that something here went wrong. But he didn't speak. and in his silence the committee heard more than any answer he could have given. Karoline stepped back, closed the binder once more. She wasn't just presenting a case, she was holding up a mirror. For a long moment no one moved. The screen behind the committee still displayed Mayor Dorsey's face, frozen mid-X-rays, her lips parted, her eyes damp. The silence in the chamber was not empty, it was full of the weight of what had just been said, of the life that had been lost. Karoline Leavitt stood perfectly still, her binder now closed, her voice quiet but unshaken. "This," she said softly, "isn't about blame anymore." She turned slowly, facing the panel once again. Her eyes didn't accuse, they pleaded. "It's about who we are." One of the representatives, an older man from North Carolina, cleared his throat, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Karoline stepped forward again, then pulled out a folded sheet of paper from her pocket. She unfolded it with care, like it meant something. Because it did. "It's a letter," she said, "from a teacher in rural Kentucky. Her name is Marissa. She ran a weekend literacy program for underserved children. Nothing fancy, just a donated space in a church basement and shelves full of secondhand books." Her voice wavered slightly, but she held the paper steady. She wrote, and I quote, "When the funding stopped, I told the kids we couldn't meet anymore. One of them, just 7, asked if the books had done something wrong. He thought we were being punished." Karoline looked up, not at Warren, at the cameras, at the country watching. A 7-year-old thought he was being punished for wanting to read. The press gallery had gone still. Even the sound of scribbling had stopped. "I don't care what algorithms we use or how efficient a spreadsheet looks. If a child thinks he did something wrong because a literacy program was shut down, then something in our system has failed." Commissioner Warren shifted in his seat. He pressed his fingers together, as if trying to focus through a fog. He opened his mouth. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Karoline nodded once, acknowledging the words but not letting them soften the point. "I believe you," she said, "but that's not a defense. That's an indictment of the system we've allowed to run without listening." She turned to the committee. "I know what some of you are thinking, that the budget is complex, that oversight can't reach every line item, that global priorities matter." She took a deep breath. "But when people can't afford their insulin, when school roofs are caving in, when the only mental health clinic in a 70-mile radius shuts its doors because of strategic realignment, we have to stop and ask, what good is strategy that forgets who it's supposed to serve?" She paused. "You say it's about long-term vision. But I ask you, who decides what the long-term is? And what happens to those who are suffering now?" For the first time, the committee chair leaned forward. "We are listening," he said. "I promise you that." Karoline offered him a nod, but her gaze never lost its fire. "I appreciate that, but listening can't be the end. It has to be the beginning." Then came another ripple of surprise. A notification flashed on the screen. Someone had just submitted a request to speak. It was a name Karoline didn't expect. Dr. Leah Menon, director of a community clinic in Atlanta that had lost funding weeks before. She joined the live stream after seeing the mayor's testimony go viral. Now she was calling in too. The screen changed. Leah's face appeared, clear, determined. "We lost our grant mid-quarter," she said. "I had to tell 5 nurses they no longer had jobs. I had to turn away a teenage mother last week because we didn't have the supplies. This isn't hypothetical, it's real, and it's happening right now." Karoline stood quietly as the committee watched the live stream in stunned silence. Then Leah looked directly into the camera. "If this system was meant to help us, then why does it feel like it only remembers us when it's too late?" That sentence hit like a drumbeat in a cathedral. Karoline returned to the microphone one last time for the day. "You've heard from me, you've heard from them. So now I'll leave you with this question. What kind of public system are we running if the public doesn't recognize themselves in it anymore?" She stepped back, not to retreat, but to let the silence do what silence does best, make people listen. The atmosphere had shifted. The live stream testimonies, the mayor's grief, the clinic director's quiet fury had left their mark. Even the committee room, once filled with procedural formality and polished indifference, now buzzed with unease. Karoline Leavitt stood before the committee, no longer just a witness. She had become something more. A voice that refused to be categorized, a force demanding truth without needing a spotlight. She stepped beside the whiteboard, quietly standing in the corner of the room, untouched. Without a word, she picked up a black marker and began to draw. No one interrupted. She sketched 3 boxes, then arrows. A flowchart emerged. Discretionary override, internal notification, passive review. She circled the final box. This, she said calmly, is the process by which billions of taxpayer dollars were redirected. No debate, no public review, no consequence. She turned to the panel. That's not oversight, that's abdication. A low murmur rolled through the back of the room. The cameras caught the moment. Karoline standing beside a system drawn in black and white, showing exactly how it had failed in color. Commissioner Warren stared at the diagram, expression blank but breathing heavier now. The carefully built distance of bureaucracy was gone. The wall had cracked. Karoline pointed at the middle of the diagram. This step, the passive review, is where you all come in, she said, turning to the committee, but it's a review in name only. No questions, no voting, just a report quietly filed and then silence. Her eyes swept the panel. We have built a process that can move billions with the stroke of a pen, yet it has no requirement to ask a single question before doing it. If that isn't a broken system, I don't know what is. The room was utterly still. Then an unexpected voice cut through the quiet. Congresswoman Elise Hartley, who had sat silently for the better part of the hearing, leaned forward and pressed her microphone button. I want to thank you, Miss Leavitt, she said. This morning I came in here thinking we'd review another budget blip, another media-fueled misunderstanding. She paused. But after what I've heard today, I'm embarrassed. Not because of what you said, but because of what we didn't ask sooner. Karoline didn't smile. She simply nodded. Respectful, but focused. Congresswoman Hartley looked to the committee chair. I move to initiate a formal review of all discretionary reallocations from the past 5 fiscal years. And I propose we draft immediate legislation to suspend override powers until public-facing audit thresholds are established. The words fell like a hammer wrapped in velvet, powerful but deliberate, and they landed. The committee chair blinked, then turned to the legal advisor beside him. A whisper, a nod, motion is acknowledged, it will be taken up in executive session. Karoline stepped away from the board. She didn't gloat, she didn't posture. Instead, she addressed the room one final time. This isn't about one commissioner or one bad decision. It's about an entire design that forgot to build in humility. Her voice dropped slightly. Public service was never supposed to mean untouchable. It was supposed to mean accountable. She placed the marker down. The most dangerous system isn't one that's corrupt, it's one that's asleep. Because asleep systems don't recognize when they've hurt people, and they don't wake up on their own. The words hung in the air, heavy, still, cutting. Karoline turned toward Warren. You didn't act alone, and maybe you truly believe this was efficient. But what matters now is what happens next. Because this is the moment we choose, whether we keep pretending or whether we finally open our eyes. The commissioner looked up at her, his lips parted. Then, quietly, he nodded. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. He understood now. Karoline turned back to the committee. The public has done its part. They spoke, they showed up, they sent letters, they made calls, they live-streamed their pain, and now the question is, will you do yours? She stepped away from the board. The silence was different this time, not stunned, convicted. The system was on trial, and this time it was listening. As Karoline Leavitt stepped away from the whiteboard, the room held its breath. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Something had shifted. The committee no longer looked like a collection of distant officials hidden behind procedural masks. They looked awake. And not just the committee, the room, the press, even Commissioner Warren, who sat still, fingers laced, eyes lowered, not in defeat, but reflection. Karoline didn't bask in it. She gathered her binder, now thick with notes and annotated tabs. It had been her shield and her sword, and now its work here was done. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, a staffer rushed into the room, whispering something into the chair's ear. He nodded. Before we adjourn, the chair announced, I've been informed that a live-streamed clip from today's session is trending. He turned his screen toward the committee. Several gasped. The video feed from Mayor Dorsey's emotional testimony, just 3 minutes long, had already passed 1 million views on social media. The clip had been stitched together with footage of Dr. Leavitt. Someone online had added soft piano music under it. The hashtag, #WakeUpOversight, was exploding. Karoline watched the screen silently. This wasn't about her. It was about what had been waiting to surface for years. The public wasn't angry. They were ready. Ready to see behind the curtain, ready to be heard again. She exited the chamber, greeted by a hallway full of reporters. Flashbulbs erupted. Microphones appeared from every angle. Questions flew. "Miss Leavitt, were you expecting this kind of reaction? What should happen to the commissioner now? Do you think this will change how discretionary powers are handled going forward?" She raised her hand gently, not to silence, but to steady. "I didn't come here to tear anything down," she said calmly. "I came to remind the system who it's supposed to serve." One reporter called out, "Do you think today was enough?" Karoline paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think today was a start." As she stepped outside, she was greeted by a scene she hadn't expected. A small group of young adults, students, parents, veterans, stood quietly with signs that read, "We deserve a voice. Oversight is not optional. Thank you for speaking up." She walked past them without a word, but then turned around. She walked back to the youngest protester, a teenage girl holding a hand-painted sign with a quote Karoline didn't recognize at first. "Silence is compliance with systems that forget their people." Karoline looked at her. "Did you write that?" The girl nodded, cheeks flushed. Karoline didn't ask for her name. She just said, "Don't stop writing." Then she turned and walked to the waiting car, but before the door could close, a voice stopped her. Low, steady, familiar. It was Congresswoman Hartley. "You know this isn't over," she said. Karoline nodded. "It never is." Hartley held out a folder. "I want your input when we draft the oversight reform package." Karoline took the folder. "Only if we make sure the people who showed up today get to be part of it too." The Congresswoman smiled. "That's the idea." The door shut gently. Karoline exhaled. Inside the car, her phone buzzed. Hundreds of messages. Journalists, lawmakers, grassroots leaders, parents, teachers, even a janitor from one of the shuttered schools. She didn't open any of them just yet. She looked out the window as the car pulled away. Past the steps, past the signs, past the system she had just shaken, not with rage, but with clarity. She hadn't come to start a movement, but sometimes the truth, spoken plainly without shouting, is all it takes. The road ahead would not be smooth, reform never is, but for the first time in a long time it felt possible, and that was enough to begin. Personally, I think Karoline Leavitt's stand in that hearing shows what happens when someone refuses to let silence bury the truth. It's a wake-up call for all of us. Systems shouldn't just run on autopilot, leaving people behind while those in power shrug it off. Her calm, relentless push for accountability reminds me that one voice can shake things up. But it also makes me wonder, are we too quick to trust reforms will fix everything? Maybe the real change starts with us demanding more every day, not just in dramatic moments like this. What do you think? Can one person really shift a broken system? Or are we kidding ourselves? I'd love to hear your take. Thanks so much for watching. This story hit me hard, and I hope it did for you too. Please like, share, and comment below with your thoughts.